SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, good morning. Here we are discussing about the planting design, various set of criteria that we need to use for our landscaping that I am discussing about. When I am talking about the environmental criterion, you will see there is one more thing that we are very much concerned with. That is a hazard potential. See, the thing is, in general, plants, it gives us good amount of oxygen, but there are certain plants or trees which are misleading. They may be good apparently, but they have some kind of hazards associated with it. Not that every time we are very familiar with it, not that we are very knowledgeable about it. So the thing is, I am just trying to give an idea that whenever you are thinking about the environmental criterion, also pay attention to the hazard potential of the plants. Most often you will find this, it does not have the hazard potential, but there are some. Here, what kind of hazards that you do have? The trees which may have solid waste potential. In fact, in general, all the trees will have solid waste potential. What is a solid waste potential? If a tree, for seasonal trees or seasonal plants, when it will die, it becomes a unusable mass, biodegradable of course, and that needs to be removed from the site. So it becomes now a solid waste to us. A plant or a group of plants which must have really enchanted us over the last 6 months by its own existence and flowering and fragrance, end of the 6 months when it has lost its life, now it becomes a burden to us. So it becomes a solid waste. Every tree which is going to shed its leaves, shed its flowers, shed its fruits, they bear solid waste potential. So this cannot be disregarded. But there are certain plants where the fruits are good, but if they are plucked and taken away separately, it is good. But if it is not, it becomes a menace. Let me give an example. You must have seen jamun tree, Jambulana, jamun tree. If you see, if you don't pluck the jamun fruit from the tree is good, big in size, big leaves, good shady tree, also fruiting. If it shades its fruits on the floor becomes a menace. The dark mauve color, dark violet color I would say, you find splattered all through, becomes a sticky floor. It becomes a real solid waste problem. The thing is, when you are using the plants, when you are assessing all its good characteristics, also try to see some negative characteristics which are there. Most often the negative characteristics are least. Okay, so solid waste potential that you have to check. Another is susceptibility to the wind flow. This is a hazard. You know what is the susceptibility I am talking about is like this. The trees, I will just cite few examples. You must have seen eucalyptus tree. Eucalyptus tree, if it is planted straight like this, has very scanty foliage in terms of, let me say in terms of this, very scanty foliage. It's very useful for some reasons, but it has two hazards. One is it is too slender, so the slenderness ratio matters here. Okay, too slender, and when it is too slender, during wind flow it will be swaying. It will be swaying in this form. It will be bending like this, depending on the wind forces. This might become hazardous. Another is that another menace of this particular tree, the hazards I call it, it has a very deep tap root, and the deep tap root, as per the records, whatever we get to know from the records, that this requires a good amount of water and because of its deep taproot, it touches the water sources faster than other trees, because the root structure is such, and then it extracts very rapidly the water. So what happens is, when it extracts the water for its own survival, the rest of the tree now becomes deprived of the water content of that particular soil. Another hazard. It is because of which we say that if suppose certain area is water scarce and the groundwater is scanty in quantity, then don't plant eucalyptus, because they will be sucking out the entire water. At the same time, the quantity of water that they are taking out, they will also transpire, no doubt about it. But the thing is that transpiration is not going to add to so much of humidity to the surroundings that which will be compensatory. It doesn't. But the point is, even if suppose it does compensate, the entire water through transpiration, if it is compensating to the overground, the groundwater has been depleted. This has to be taken care of. Okay. So susceptibility to the wind flow is one. Another is, I'll talk about these trees more when some of the trees more when I'll come to this particular point. Some trees are of disturbing smell. The flower may be smelly, means bad smell, or pungent smell. Bad means unwanted or uncomfortable smell. Okay. Pungent smell. Some of the trees, they have the flowers, but the smell is pungent, but whether it is liked or disliked by people, there are differences of opinion. I've checked with my students. I've also asked people. Some people like it, some people don't like it. Some people feel it very disturbing, choking. Some people say, I like it very much. The point is, these are okay. People who don't like it, if suppose there are more number of people responding saying that we don't like it, then naturally that tree gets negated. So you check the hazard potential of this. Some trees also bear poisonous fruits, maybe having a very good flower, the flower which is being used in the household, but the fruit is highly poisonous. And since it is in the open, we really cannot educate everybody saying that the fruits are poisonous. So we have to take care of this. So I am not saying which tree of what kind of negatives, but it is our duty for diligence. We have to check any plant that we have shortlisted for use in the landscape, also try to find out its other hazard potentials. Solid waste potential is automatically intrinsic and it comes with a package. Susceptibility to the wind depends on the slenderness ratio. Disturbance smell is by the own intrinsic characteristics of the fragrance of flower or leaf or whatever. Poisonous fruits is intrinsic to this, so it has to be checked. Some trees also has the poisonous leaves. Tree looks good, but the leaves are poisonous. So what we have to check is all those hazards. Then let's come to cultural criteria. I have already tried to say that what is that cultural criteria that we are referring to, but let us see with respect to its attributes what comes under the cultural criterion. Climatological tolerance is what? Here I would request you that instead of criteria, write down criterion, because criterion is singular. So when I am saying cultural criteria, basically I am trying to see the cultural criteria of multiple such kind of plants. That's why it is criteria, but if you try to read this word as cultural criterion as a singular. Climatological tolerance, a plant, how it is tolerant climatologically in that particular location. Then comes a city tolerance. Each city has a different kind of microclimate. It is contributed by its own intrinsic characteristics of topography, temperature conditions, the geography, the pollutions or the emissions, whatever. So it has some kind of its climatic characteristics. So how it is tolerant to that city, the city tolerance. Hardiness, the trees which are whether it is hardy, means you take from one particular cultural condition to another cultural condition, how fast it is going to be succumbing to its negative, or else how strong it is to resist or adapt to the next changed climate. Then comes the resistance to pests and insects. Different kind of climates will have different kind of pests and insects, and the trees of different climates, when it is taken to another climate, another cultural situation, whether the pests and insects which are intrinsic to the changed location, it is acceptable or adaptable. This has to be checked. Then the soil texture, tolerance and sensitivity. basically what I discussed about the soil texture in the last lecture, it's basically the composition of the proportion of sand, silt and clay. Now here interesting thing is the soil texture is going to be more effective or more usable or applicable in our tree's root structure. Okay, different roots, root forms, root structure, which I'll discuss in detail in course of this discussion. Different root structure would be adaptable to different kind of soil texture. In some cases that may be that okay, if the structure has more of sandy nature, it survives well, the root grips well. But sometimes it may be that okay, if it is silty in nature or silty in more in proportion, it holds good. So holding the roots holding capability is very much directly proportional to the or related to the soil texture. So how much it is acceptable, that item you have to check. Then the soil chemistry tolerance or sensitivity means how much it is tolerant to the soil chemistry, acidic, alkaline or saline. In many of the coastal areas where the soil chemistry is basically predominantly saline, so naturally it gives growth to extensive some specific species like coconut and others. But you go to the other areas which is hot arid and try to plant coconut may not grow well because it requires a saline chemistry of the soil. So this has to be checked. Leafing character is whether it is deciduous or evergreen. This is intrinsic to a plant, of course, but the thing is intrinsically whether the evergreen tree is going to function well or deciduous tree is going to function well in a particular climate. So essentially when I am saying the cultural, I am talking about a geographical location, original root of its geographical location and the climate, corresponding climate and the soil. So basically if you check, I would say for cultural conditions, if you have to check, you check the geography. The moment you check the geography, you also see the soil quality and also see the climate. So when you are going to check the climate, naturally you are going to check the solar condition, you are going to check the humidity condition or precipitation condition, and also you are going to check the wind condition and solar condition in terms of temperature as well as light. So basically what will happen is when you are checking the cultural condition, all these are going to be reviewed with respect to specific plants. The light requirement, I will discuss this in detail, but the light requirement, whether this particular tree requires what amount of light for its survival and or sustenance, that you have to check. You also have to check the growth rate. You take one particular plant from one cultural situation to another cultural context, one cultural context to another cultural context, you will find that the growth will be varied. It will be impeded or it will be faster. It all depends on the different climatic, different cultural conditions. So growth rate is another. Now if I check with respect to this, let me go back to this slide once again for its reference altogether. So you are checking with respect to the climatological tolerance. So if you see this, the geography, soil and climate, and the climate with solar condition, humidity, wind and light all together, you will find that humidity is basically going to give you the quantity of water, okay, superficial water, that means in the air, even the amount of water that is now contained within that under the ground. So when you check this, be very, very cautious. It is because of this you will find when I said that when you are making the sieve, best is to make a first sieve of cultural condition. If you find that the plants are growing well in a particular locality, in a particular cultural condition, and the other site where you are trying to plant a similar species over there, and they also correspond to the similar climate or similar cultural condition, then you don't have to really worry. You can always take these plants and grow there. But if you find no, they are diametrically opposite, or they are in fact, like say you are taking a plant from a highly rain prone area to a hot arid region, or vice versa, a hot arid region tree or plant, now you are trying to plant in another cultural condition like say rain prone or hot humid areas or warm humid areas, you have to really cross check. Okay, once you do this, you will find that you are making decisions which are very objective. It is not arbitrary. It is not because it looks good. It is not because it is functionally good, or it is not because it is environmentally conducive. It is because you know that this particular tree will grow. When we say something like, say, a particular intrinsic characteristics of a plant which is culturally defined, we have to really pay more attention to this and understand more of this. I can also tell you one thing, that frankly speaking, we don't have sufficient amount of data or sufficient amount of references which gives us a very clear cut idea about or classification of plants culturally. But there are some hints, some of the documents which are saying that, okay, this tree is good for tropical, this tree is good for rain prone area, high humid area, this tree is good for hot area, this is good for temperate climates. There are some indication. But the thing is, when you are practicing, I think you have to do a little extra more work or give more effort to find out what is there. The next question is operational criteria. Operational criteria, what it is? Let's say I'm comparing with visual, functional, environmental, cultural. Understood. What is that operational thing? Operational thing is very contextual to the location where you are working at that particular position. It can start with even like, say, whether do you have a good kind of executioner, let's say executor, contractor, who can make this garden or make this landscape created on the site the way I want. It starts with that kind. That means operational is how it is going to work in terms of doing the work in site. So, but here many issues I have just listed one by one. The client's requirements, it's operational. If the client doesn't want certain plants, you cannot give. It becomes very, very sensitive. Availability in suitable size. You require a plant in a locality. Is it available? It may so happen that you have to select these plants and get it from somewhere else. So the availability is important. Then maintenance requirement. Some plants may require good higher maintenance operations. I would suggest, if suppose some plants do require higher maintenance operation and you don't have much of funding for the maintenance, I would say don't select that particular plant. It is operational criterion that no, I don't want it, because who is going to pay for that? And if I don't pay for this, if I don't go for maintenance, this particular tree is not going to survive. Then transplantation limitations. Quite often we think of getting a tree in a landscape in its full shape and form, that means mature form. Then comes the question of transplantation. I have to take the whole plant. I am not referring to the transplantation means you take a sapling from the nursery and then plant it here. This is not transplantation. You are only taking that particular sample and bringing it here. I am referring to the transplantation as a process in which the whole fully grown tree I found somewhere, I am purchasing it and then lifting it up from there in its living condition, and then I am going to plant it here. That is what is transplantation I am talking about. There may be limitations in terms of expertise, limitation in terms of machineries, limitation in terms of cost, limitation in terms of will of the client. Naturally, if it is very costly, why the client would like to have a large tree there? Okay. Transplantation limitations and cost of transplantation, if I am talking about, then transplantation limitations I am talking about the technical transplantation. Logistics. We require different kind of machineries. We require different kind of the transportation equipments like vehicles. But the cost, who is going to bear this cost? Is it worthy of this particular cost? Then other operational thing like cattle proneness. Some plants, most of the plants are very highly, they are very cattle attracted. And cattle proneness is a menace. It's a menace in our landscape. Large area landscape which you are developing, you don't expect that the entire square feet of this is going to be protected by some people. You created a green nature. At the same time, now you made a barbed wire all around or a wall around, and then you are putting a security guard at the point. This does not make it a real landscape. Landscape is something where your eye is going to flow through the nature. You have created, there's a domain, your eye is flowing through the nature, and you are seeing the landscape as a part of the nature. But in that case, now you have to think about protection of your plants. And if suppose you find that the other habitations which are around and they have good amount of cattle, and the cattle are let loose, let free, and they are entering into your site for grazing purposes, and they are attacking all these plants or trees which are highly coveted by the cattle as a cattle fodder, then what do? It becomes a problem. It is because of which you remember that just now I said and given an example that initial young tree has to be guarded by the tree guards. It is mainly to protect against the cattle. What I am talking about cattle, there are also vandals. I am thinking about the cattle, but also there are vandals. Susceptibility to the wind flow is also a matter which comes under the operational criteria. It is highly susceptible. There are some trees which will be breaking very easily in the winds. They may be swaying. Some trees which are swaying is one thing, but that came under the hazard. So many of these which you will find, they come as a hazard here. So susceptibility I am talking about is fine, but if suppose the wind flow ultimately forces the branches to break and then ultimately fall on the floor, it may cause hazards, it may be fatal, it may be also a solid waste that is generated because of the wind flow. So this you have to consider. There is another thing in terms of operational criteria. There are multiple utilities. Plant for environmental purpose or functional purpose or visual purpose has a utility, whichever. Now suppose let us take an example that one particular tree which is highly strongly used for environmental purpose, and then it also has a functional purpose. 2 satisfied. It also looks good. 3 satisfied. Culturally all right. 4 criterion satisfied. But it has another utility. That utility which is of household, that negates all the effects, because if suppose now it has multiple utility in which the building utility or household utility is strong or medicinal utility is strong, then it becomes a menace for us. So this you have to take into consideration. And when I was talking about the cattle, how about prone to vandalisms? Prone to vandalisms, essentially, see the points which I said, I mentioned about medicinal utility of a plant material which is highly susceptible to vandalisms in terms of scraping out the skins, it's vandalisms. Chopping down a sandalwood tree is vandalism. Plucking fruits from a tree is vandalism unless authorized. Human vandalism is another very strong one. You can take care of the cattle's vandalisms, all right, we do understand, but how to protect your plants from this, the prone to human vandalisms? But however, this is a part we grow with, and we have to take care of this. So this operational criteria that you have to check. And there is one more thing, there is experience factor. All said and done, experience factor. It is, suppose, my suggestion is this, suppose you are planning a landscape for a particular location which you are not very familiar with, but I am sure that when you are following the process of design or plans, you are taking note of everything, and now you are designing. Let me also take it for granted that you are highly knowledgeable and you know everything about the plant materials, everything about that location, everything about the culture, all said and done, everything known. Still I would say trust the experience factor. This experience factor, for which what you have to do, you go to the local nursery, talk to them. The list of plants that you have selected, share with them, discuss with them, try to know from them that is it a right choice. If there is any other connoisseur, if there is any other botanist expert, horticulturist expert, talk to them. Or even if you find that there is a construction and maintenance department in terms of landscape, and there are people working years after years in the same city, talk to them. Take note of their experience and pay value to their experiences. Experience factor cannot be really judged by quantification. Experience factor is essentially, it comes through seeing things over the years, and when you take that experience factor and add it to your operational criterion, you will find that you will be doing things in a much better way. An example of experience factor, let me tell you. A landscape site that you have been given, you have studied. In your site analysis, you did not find that there is any kind of termites in the site. You have not seen. Fine. go and talk to the local people, talk to the pedologists, talk to the plant scientists, local, or even horticulturists. They will tell you that this particular locality is in general infested with the termites. Maybe the site that you are studying now, in which there is no termite visible because there is no such, no attraction for the termites. But the moment you start do plantations, then naturally termites will come in and they will spoil your trees and vegetations. Take that experience factor in your ambit. When you do that, you will find that automatically the entire design is going to be very, very proper. Now, let me give you a very brief idea. I don't want to go into the details of this now because I am reserving this for my second part of the second episode of my lectures, in which lots of discussions are supposed to be within this. But still, I'll tell you one thing. If suppose you have thought about various criteria based on which you made your selection. When you are making the selection of what? Plant materials. When I am saying plant materials of which kind? So it comes in different forms, and when you are using this plants in your landscape, different forms will give different kind of appearances, it will occupy different kind of spaces and volumes, and also it will behave differently with respect to different climates. It is because of which just to have a brief idea about these forms of plants materials is essential. After we discuss about these plant materials, then I'll go into the individual items of characteristics for plant materials to conclude my whole discussion for today. There are different kind of forms: tree, shrub, creeper, grass, cacti or succulents, aquatic, bulbs, orchids. Essentially what happens is, how do you know what is what? Most often the trees are of single trunk oriented. So if suppose you have any plant that you see like this which has a single trunk, you can classify this as a tree. Shrubs are generally multi-trunk. If you see such plant, you should say it is shrub. Height is varying for different plants, different heights for different plants. Shrubs are generally not very tall. Since they are not very tall, it's very easy to identify or say differentiate between a tree and a shrub. Shrub may go up to the height of say 10 to 15 feet. That means 3 to 5 meter about, roughly. Okay. Tree generally you will find it will be ranging from 10 upward to whatever height. Shrub you will find that they don't have much wider spread. It may be at the most 3 meter, but the tree can go up to any meter. We have example in a Calcutta Botanical Garden, I think more than 200-year-old banyan tree, which is several feet, about say more than 200 feet spread, widespread, okay, 60 meter. So this is how, when you are looking at it, we must know the form of this. So tree, then the shrub, and the creepers are those kind of plants which generally are have soft stems, and they generally require supports, whether it's grills, whether it's trellis or some other trees, but they do require, so they have a prostate in nature, they will flowing, it is something like, so when I like to draw a creeper, it is something like which will be supported. Okay. Grass is essentially a different form of plant which is growing from the soil. It has its own root structure, but it does not grow to a larger height. Different kind of grasses. So in my next series of discussion, where I'll talk about these forms of plant materials, I'll discuss in detail about all the different kind of trees, different kind of shrubs and all. I'm just introducing you to this, that when you find the small spike like thing which is spiking out as the leaf blades from the ground, it's the grass. Cacti and succulents are the kind of plants which are thorny in nature. They don't have generally, whether to call this a stem or the leaf it's a question, but we do see the cacti and succulents which are fleshy material, mostly we say fleshy stems, it may have flowers and all that, and they hold water within itself. In fact, all these trees will be holding the water, but the quantity of water that is being held is very, very little. But the cactus, it holds a good amount of water for its own survival. Okay. Aquatic plants are those which have the root structure which grows well in the water, in the moist condition. It doesn't require soil. But there are some plants which are semi-aquatic nature. That means the roots will be growing better in the moist soil. Okay. The bulbs are the one where the root structure is of the bulbous nature. So basically it is like onion shape kind, the bulbous nature. And orchids is one special kind of plants which has its own intrinsic characteristics subjected to its original cultural conditions. There are different kind of species. But the point is, when I am using this, there are some more terms you will be hearing. That terminology you will be hearing, I have just listed over here. It's hedge, season flower. Look at the screen: hedge, seasonal flowering, ground cover, weeds. Now they are not plants by itself. These are a different kind of appearance of the plants in its own self. Let me explain. It is very hard to explain this. If suppose I plant a series of trees one after another and make a wall, it can be called a hedge. Generally we call this as a hedge row. If we plant a series of shrubs one after another, it makes a hedge. You remember that in your European landscapes we saw lots of such hedges of this kind of profile, or maybe sometime even this kind of profile in Japanese landscapes, this kind of profiles in our European landscapes. This is called hedge. So hedge is basically a series of plants, same plants placed one after another. I am saying same plants, but I can tell you, if suppose you have multiple such plants, then also it should be called hedge. Hedge is just one profile of vegetation in combination. Seasonal flowering, it may be shrubs, it may be even trees, it may be creepers, but the thing is, it is basically seasonally it will be flowering. So we call season flowers. Season flowers means in a particular season this will be flowering. We take this kind of tree, but basically they are shrubs. They may be creepers. Okay. Ground cover is also another form of vegetation. Let me take the example of most common ground cover, that is called grass. So whenever we have a surface which is covered with grass, it's ground cover. Basically the vegetation covering the ground. Hedge is a vertical element, the ground covers are generally horizontal elements. Now the same thing, if suppose on this site, if you have small height shrubs planted all over like this, that's also ground cover. So ground cover basically is the vegetation that is covering the ground. If suppose you look at the entire landscape site from above, you have a series of trees that you are seeing covering a large area. That's also a ground cover. But only thing is, we don't pay much heed to that, because we are always in the landscape, we are experiencing this at the base level, at the ground level. That's why we never see the landscape from the top. But if suppose I would have seen a landscape from the top, say top of 25-story building, and then I am trying to see the whole landscape from the top, then a series of trees placed and covering a ground is a ground cover for me. Okay. And weeds is very peculiar thing. Weeds is negative aspects to us. Hedge, season flower and ground cover are all positive elements to us, positive forms, but weed is always a negative form of plants. Interestingly, weed is also another type of plant. Weed can be a tree can be called a weed, a shrub can be called a weed, or any such creepers, grass, cacti, succulents, aquatic bulbs or orchids, all can be called weeds only if it is negative to another plants. That's what is a weed. Weed is then, in that case, what happens is, how would you identify weeds? Quite often, if you see a lawn, in that, if I'm just trying to draw a little bigger sketch here, you'll find that these are all grass leaf blades, and then maybe there are small plantations. They are also being grown automatically. Nobody plants it. But these are the plants which have survived over in presence of the grass and taking away much amount of water and not allowing that amount of water to be taken by these grasses. To that extent that could have been released. Now this particular vegetation becomes a weed. If suppose you plant here one kind of grass and then there is another kind of grass that you plant, suppose another kind of grass a slightly higher size, then I would tell you, if this is grass 1 and this is grass 2 and the grass 2 is your objective and the grass 1 becomes the weed, if it is now negating the effects of this, then the grass 1 also will become weed. That's why weed is, if I summarily say, is that form of plant which becomes counterproductive or contrasting or negative to the other plants. So these are different kind of forms of plants that we do use in our landscape, and we'll have a greater detailed discussion on this. Okay, so far different criterion and the different forms which we are discussing with. Now in the next series of discussion, I will go into the individual characteristics of plant materials. Okay, enjoy it. Thank you.